Totally, totally. And that's very much in the direction of now the next run of slides we have here, which is about moving this system that I just kind of unrolled in a terminal in a Jupyter notebook or whatever. Now, like, how do we actually put this into a production system, right? It's like we need to think about exactly to Hugo's point. Like, imagine now, like, I made this RAG pipeline and I pushed the whole thing into production. And now a new feature lands in Metaflow's documentation, like the @PyPy decorator. How do I know, like, when is the data that is the documentation of that thing? Like, when is it actually going to be in this RAG pipeline? Becomes a super important question in practice then, when it's like we're trying to solve around this issue of like ChatGPT doesn't know the context that we're talking about Metaflow. It doesn't know the context past whatever cutoff OpenAI's training data is. Like, how do we actually like build systems to continuously be refreshing something like the Pinecone index or the LanceDB index or whatever tool you use to.
Absolutely. And I think you've motivated it well here, Eddie, in terms of, you quote unquote wanting your flow to know when this stuff has been done. But I even think in some organizations, that different teams may be responsible, and a lot of time will be responsible for different parts of what's going on here, right? So your data pre-processing flow may be owned by a data engineering team, and the model flow by a data science or machine learning team. So, and you don't, want to be messaging people on Slack every time the pre-pressing, Slack is where work happens, but APIs are where work happens as well, right? And event triggering and event buses are where work really, some of the exciting work happens. So perhaps what we're moving towards is figuring out how a data pre-processing flow can actually just trigger a model flow, which then could trigger an inference flow, right?
Exactly. And maybe as you're doing your data pre-processing around like curating your RAG pipeline, maybe something goes wrong, and then you want to use a Slack API to alert Hugo, like, hey man, something broke. What do we do about this? And then we like have a little debugging session to get together or something like this. Like it's important to start thinking about like, let's get out of the Jupyter notebook mindset for 1 second and kind of zoom out and think about, if we want to run this stuff in these workflows, what sort of hooks do we need in that system, and how do we afford them? So I guess that really the argument of this section here is Metaflow is a nice tool for that.
Yep.
And we're going to show you how to do it with the same code that we just did in our Jupyter notebook. So Metaflow has a lot of these features we've been discussing, but it also has this notion of being like an orchestrator that you can either schedule jobs and run them on a calendar, or you can trigger them based on events happening, or like in the story Hugo was describing, based on other workflows, maybe from a different team. Finishes data pre-processing workflow that runs every night at 12 p.m. or something, or that would be the afternoon, every afternoon at 12 p.m. And then whenever that workflow finishes, we train a new model, or we do something, do whatever downstream.
Yeah. And these are all really nice examples, Eddie. And I do, as we're kind of moving towards, I just do want to clear, like, the abstraction layer we want to think about these things are events, right? When something relevant happens, that's an event, right?
Exactly.
Such as data being updated, S3, something in an S3 bucket changing, a workflow finishing, whatever it is, and whatever you think is an important event.
Exactly. Now, connecting this event-triggered world to RAG, or maybe scheduled workflow world to RAG, one of the ways that we wrote about this in the blog post I mentioned earlier is like, how can you visualize this entire system of happening? Like, basically, we've already went through kind of the dark gray box on top here in the last notebook. So it's basically this idea of like, we have this online user who sends in a query, like the thing about the vague question about Metaflow. That thing needs to get embedded in the same way that all the other things in the vector store got embedded. Then we do this matching process, get something that we consider kind of like factual data out of that matching process, and then use it to make the LLM generate things that are much more tightly scoped to our actual documentation or whatever source we consider a source of truth. Now, like, how do we actually populate that index is really the question that we're asking when we get into the workflow realm, and what we're going to show you how to do in the Metaflow sandbox, which this is basically taking the code that we just wrote to like chunk up the Metaflow documentation and then embed it into Pinecone. And then we're going to run that every night. And we're basically going to chain the different parts of the workflow into 3 separate workflows that are all like triggering each other, essentially, as an end-to-end chain.
Super cool, man.
Specifically, we have 3 sections. We're going to have this markdown chunker, which is named, I just like the word chunker.
Yeah.
This thing is going to run on a schedule, maybe every night. You could change it to hourly, run it as a cron job, whatever. When this thing finishes, we're going to do the pre-processing and kind of log a card is the Metaflow terminology, which shows a data visualization of what happened. And then when that thing finishes, it's going to trigger the pinecone indexing part. So like one reason why you might want to think about separating stuff like this into like either different steps in your workflow, or like we see here into just 3 independent workflows, is that the first 2 are like relatively low resource intensive. Maybe they're just things that we want to like can do like massively in parallel on very cheap computers. But this third one where we're actually going to compute embeddings and then put it into the pinecone vector indexer, that could be very compute intensive. Like if we had 4 million documents, the story we were talking about earlier, maybe we need 10 machines with GPUs on them or something in parallel. And we want to like quickly be able to turn that on. So it's like useful to kind of separate that part of the workflow into its own little like subsystem.
Sorry, maybe it's just worth adding. I mean, Eddie has just really talked about the 3 different steps that we want to trigger one another, and why we've chosen why those 3 steps, with very reasonable choices there. These are design choices that you want to make yourself. So you might have a whole series of steps involved, and maybe we'd choose to do it in a different way to you. But depending on your organizational concerns, how your teams work, business concerns, compute concerns, you might, parse this, chunk this differently. So
it's all about chunking. No,
yeah,
that's a great point. Yeah, it's really like up to you as a system designer is the idea. Like Metaflow is not telling you what to do, it's just giving you primitives to build whatever system you need to build.
exactly.
So like what are these things actually though? Like I spoke a lot at a high level on the last slide. Like what I mean by you can schedule the markdown chunker workflow. This is a simple decorator in Metaflow when I say that I want to run it every week. When I say that these are like relatively low resource, I'm just saying like these are 8,000 megabyte machines. That's all I really care about. I want you to run it from this Docker image where I've already like packaged up all my dependencies. So before Hugo was kind of talking about Conda and the pip decorator from Metaflow, you can also use Docker is kind of what this is showing here. So Metaflow is like very complete coverage of the different dependency management solutions.
And Eddie, just to stop you for 1 second,
Yeah.
I've been so excited about all the LLM stuff we've been doing. I actually forget if we've really introduced the basics of writing a Metaflow flow. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe
Good
I'll just
point.
say a few words that
Yeah, please go
it's
for it.
you use a class definition. It's object-oriented programming. We have templates for this type of stuff. If you're not so comfortable with that, you use @step to define each step. We don't really mind what, like, we want you to do whatever steps you want. Essentially, we do enforce, Metaflow does enforce a start step and an end step, but you can do anything in between, including like big branch outs and massive parallelization, as long as you join correctly, of course. So you're building a DAG here. It's all Pythonic. Instead of writing YAMLs and this type of stuff, we want you to be able to use decorators such as @Kubernetes, and we can see where specifying the containerization story here, the Docker, you can use @PyPI, you can use @Conda as well, specifying the amount of resources, whole variety of decorators, which allow you to specify different things. As part of the productionization story, you can see all you really need to use here is an @schedule weekly equals true decorator here as well. And I presume what we're going to see is how you deploy that using Argo or something along those lines on the command line, which is a relatively simple command. The reason I wanted to make this clear is that Metaflow wants you to write your Python code the way you like to write it. And all Metaflow enforces is some basic design principles around how to write a DAG, directed acyclic graph, or machine learning workflow there. We've got in our onboarding tutorials on the sandbox, you can check all of that stuff as well. That was just kind of a whirlwind 2-minute introduction to what's happening here for those interested.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, just to like piggyback on one thing Hugo was saying that I think is very important here is like we just see the outline of a Metaflow workflow here.
Yeah.
All the user code, like your research code and your business logic, is these dots inside of the start step and the end step. This is where you put, maybe you call a script that you've written and would run independent of Metaflow otherwise. Or maybe you just put the code directly here because you can run arbitrary Python code. Point is that the code that's inside the start step getting lifted up to run in Kubernetes with 8,000 GB RAM inside the Kubernetes pod, these kinds of things.
So cool.
Cool. So the second flow, just another example of what this stuff looks like. So we can connect to our Markdown chunker workflow, that one that we're going to deploy in a second, that we're looking at the actual Python code of. We can connect this workflow to now run whenever that one finishes using this @trigger on finish decorator. And then we see like maybe another Metaflow use case here that we have this notion of parameters. So you can like pass different values in from that workflow. Maybe something happens in the Markdown workflow that is information that we specifically want to pass into this one. Things like this. Again, with the Kubernetes decorator, a new decorator here called @card. This is a way to kind of do some experiment tracking to visualize data in matplotlib charts or plot with Plotly or Altair, whatever your favorite framework is. Many other things you can do too, like you can make kind of different tables, represent different widgets inside of whatever sort of like experiment tracking dashboard you want to compose, really. And then the final one that we're going to see is the Pinecone vector indexer workflow. This one's also trigger on finish with the data table processor, as we discussed. And then just kind of furthering the dependency management story, we're using another Docker image, but this time a much meatier Docker image, because this one needs to have GPU dependencies and it needs to have all the transformers machinery built into it. So we might request an instance with more memory on it, more CPUs and or GPU. And then we can easily just swap in and out Docker images like this is a big superpower of Metaflow. Cool. So now like we're kind of getting into like a little bit more the conceptual layer here, and I think it'd be a good time to just like actually run some code and get
Let's do it.
Running. All right. So I am going to expand this thing again. And when we open up the sandbox and go to lesson 5, we'll see the full workflow with the code actually written in.
And maybe I'll just add one word about Argo. Argo is a way that we schedule or deploy machine learning workflows. If you've used something like AWS step functions, maybe that's a point of comparison here. But essentially what Argo allows us to do, and maybe you can add a bit more color to this, Eddie, is in terms of productionizing machine learning models, we want to make sure that when I close my laptop at the end of the day and go and have dinner with my family, that we have it running somewhere external to my laptop. And that's something that Argo allows us to do, right, Eddie?
Yeah, that's right. That's right, Hugo. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the terminal here. And now this is going to be, I'm actually just going to type the command out. These buttons are kind of like automating the process, but I think it's more illustrative to actually just type it out. So we have the flow.py inside
so it's Python, then the name of the flow and the path to the flow.
Right, which this is just a Python script. So that's the name of the script that we see visualized here. And then to actually deploy this workflow, you type Argo workflows and create. Make this terminal a little bit bigger here. So you see it looks somewhat similar to when we just run the workflow directly. Deploying to Argo workflows. And then we get a bunch of interesting information from Metaflow, which I won't really go too deep into detail, but like there's a whole machinery around namespaces and production branches and things that afford like A/B testing, multi-arm bandit testing, these sorts of things in your actual production system. So you can have side-by-side deployments is really the upshot there. Cool. Now let's keep moving. The second one that we want to deploy, let's make this a bit smaller, is the same exact pattern. So looking through this, we see a bunch of like Seaborn, matplotlib code, see a bunch more parameters for our data processing stuff. Then the thing that we're going to look at in a little bit is this @card. So let's just go ahead and get this stuff running. So we have Argo workflows and then create and that's good. Oops.
Wait, we're creating another flow now? Sorry, is that?
Yeah, we're deploying the second flow. So we deployed that first Markdown chunker one, and now this one we're deploying is the data processing one.
But weren't we going to have one trigger the other, or?
Exactly. Yeah. So this second one has the @trigger on finish decorator.
Right. So deploying it isn't running it, is what I'm hearing, right?
Correct. So when I say deploy, I'm running this create command. Now, if we wanted to just trigger this thing that's already on Argo, we could just replace create with trigger,
Yeah, yeah.
and that would do what you're suggesting.
Yep.
Cool. Now let's deploy the third one, and hopefully, if the demo gods are kind to us today, we'll just get this like end to end, all three of them running after just running one trigger command.
Yep.
Is the idea. Now there's one thing that I left blank up here because I didn't want to put it in a GitHub repository. We'll again do the super hack of just pasting my Pinecone key. But of course, actually, I should show you this instead of just saying it. Metaflow has this feature called secrets that if you're cringing at the fact that I'm doing this, you should check this out because this is the real way in a production system that you'd approach.
Yeah, and I'm not cringing. I'm totally cool if you do it. We just got to tell people about secrets and environment variables, and also you got to delete that key afterwards.
Well, I just get nervous that I'm suggesting like absolutely
Totally.
terrible people.
The thing that's making me most nervous now is your battery level, dude.
Oh yeah. Well, it's gonna be a buzzer beater. We might have to end the call early on the fine tuning part.
It's like the episode of Seinfeld where Kramer's like going below zero on the gas tank.
Yeah, dude, this is my way. Okay, so our last Argo workflows creates in section 6, the Pinecone indexer.
And we got to look at the Argo UI or something like that as well, or
yeah. So let's I'm gonna get the workflow running and then we'll click into the UI. Well, actually,
I just thought it may be interesting to see that it's created but not deployed yet.
Oh, sure. Good idea. Good idea. So I actually just opened up the Metaflow UI, which is connected to Argo. And soon, by the way, this Metaflow UI will be a complete superset of the features in Argo UI. So just point of order. But it's not in the current sandbox edition of the Metaflow UI. So to Hugo's point, we don't see any workflows running in Argo right now.
But we should see them created. Yeah, exactly.
These things that Argo calls workflow templates. So this is kind of like what Metaflow is like, kind of sort of compiling the DAG that we wrote in our Python code into Argo's language of these workflow templates, which we can click into them and then we can specifically see what I'm talking about. Like these are, for people familiar with Argo, these are like the familiar YAML monstrosities that you would run into.
Pardon me.
Okay, cool. So again, what we want to do, trigger this markdown chunker thing. That should automatically trigger the data processor, should automatically trigger our Pinecone indexer. Let's do it. So now in order to do this, we have basically the same command that we ran before. So let's find our section 4 command. And all we should need to do is take away create and write trigger.
Incredible.
And we'll see.
Great.
Okay, so we get this helpful printout to the Metaflow UI. But to Hugo's point, we want to let's just look in Argo because it'll be a little bit more responsive right now. So we see that this first workflow is triggered.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like watch what's happening.
And this will be the DAG of the workflow, so that's the start step.
Exactly.
Very cool.
Well, while we're waiting on this, Hugo, because it might take a few minutes, is a bit of a product plug. But for anybody who's still watching this video, I feel totally okay doing that. Have you seen the visualizations of these DAGs on the Outer Bounds platform recently with all the work that's been going on there on the front end side of things?
Not recently. Do you want to show me?
Oh man, super exciting. I don't think I have a great example loaded up. Maybe we should do this. We should actually do a full video on that sometime, I think, like comparing to Argo, like because like there's a bunch of cool stuff that's now being like consumed into the Metaflow UI that is like equivalent to what we're looking at now.
Amazing. Well, watch this space, everyone.
Yes, watch this space. Watch this space. Consider Outer Bounds platform.
So the other thing is we've got a few more slides to show, and then we're going to talk about, I wonder whether just coming back to make sure that this is executed correctly after going through the rest of the workshop would be the way to go.
Yeah, we can definitely go ahead and do that. Do you want to look at the fine-tuning code right away, or should we go back to the slides, do you think?
I'll take your lead, Eddie.